In NATO, the blunder which sparked the near riots in China happened because pilots mistook the building for a military depot. President Clinton said it was a tragic mistake and apologized to both the leaders and the people of China, but pledged to continue the air campaign. The protest became increasingly violent. The authorities did nothing to stop them. Down with American devils, they shouted.
To put some pressure on the Serbs and get this diplomatic thing even more energized, and let's keep working and put it behind us. No one would be happier than me when it's over.
It seems the embassy is clearly targeted. This is not really a kind of mistake.
You know, this office looks like our country is in need of reconstruction in order to have a future.
The last video set the stage by exploring the market for governmentality, fusing the boundaries between state and non-state actors, through organized crime, paramilitary units and corruption. This video follows those lessons, along with new ones in 3 extensive acts, to understand 2 of the most important questions of our time. How and why exactly did a geopolitical turn for Russia-China against the West occur? Going from friendly relations right after the Cold War to tense adversaries at the turn of the millennium. How has warfare changed in this dynamic? Looking at the war in eastern Ukraine, PMCs worldwide, and contemporary Russian and Chinese military discourse. Emerging in 1998, the Clinton administration was consumed by the incendiary Levinsky affair. In attempts to deflect it, Clinton resorted to bombing Iraq. He was met by a public indifferent to Saddam's most recent transgressions. Meanwhile, in the remains of Yugoslavia, the tactics of the Islamic Kosovo Liberation Army started to involve hit-and-run attacks on Serb patrols. These were done to force them into excessive retaliation. The KLA were hoping to provoke acts of ethnic cleansing that will be shown at the Rambo peace talks. Before going up against the grand jury investigating his affair, Clinton declared that America would sooner or later have to face the matter of deploying troops in Kosovo due to diplomatic exhaustion. He proposed creating a UN protectorate held together by international military presence. The drawback to this was that NATO ground troops would become vulnerable. The same month as the impeachment hearing, Bin Laden carried out attacks on American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. Clinton retaliated against him by ordering the first recognized preemptive strike against a violent non-state actor, however without results. Instead, it turned into another propaganda victory for the group.
It's clear that Serb forces are now engaged in further attacks on Kosovar civilians, with additional units on the way. We cannot allow President Milosevic to continue the aggression with impunity. I have also sent a letter to President Yeltsin about the urgency of the situation.
Whether he goes to The Hague or whether he goes to a monastery or whether he goes, wherever the hell he goes, he must be gone.
There is strong unity among the NATO allies. Our objective in Kosovo remains clear: to stop the killing and achieve a durable peace that restores Kosovars to self-government.
In January 1999, The Serbian military killed 45 Kosovo Albanians in the town of Racket. Milosevic maintained that they were KLA rebels. Clinton nonetheless condemned this assertion, ordering a media offensive to push public approval towards imminent incursion under a humanitarian pretext. But the NATO coalition was interfered by Russia and China's UN delegates. Until now, the Serbs have refused Western demands, acting under the assumption that the US would not gather a decisive UN approval to intervene using direct force. Yeltsin had made it clear that America and Russia have a vast area of congruent interests. Chief among these is the stability in the international situation. Despite lacking the UN Security Council's authorization, NATO would initiate the bombing campaign against Milosevic that lasted for 2 months. Russian public opinion turned to disaster as the airstrikes targeted their allies' capital. At the same time, their attempts at negotiating were rejected by US officials. Yeltsin faced growing hostility in parliament, and Russian strategic behavior grew hastier. This served as a turning point in the war, as well as Russian-American relations, and it set the soon-to-be President Putin entirely against the US. With the UN order shattered, national interest continued to be the prime mover among leading states, rather than symbolic international legitimacy. NATO expansion would also damage Russian economic interest by turning the arms markets westward. Potential NATO members would be reluctant depending on Russian-produced armaments, locking them out. The Chinese also took note of this new Kosovo precedent and the sidestepping of the UN Security Council, as it could be equally used in a scenario to interfere with Taiwan and the ethnic zones along the border, Xinjiang, Tibet, and Inner Mongolia. There are many theories purported by the media in regards to the US bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. The most prominent one is that the anti-radar attack was recovered from the downed American stealth aircraft and kept in there. If it was to be handed over to the Chinese by the Serbs, the bombing would have hindered them from gaining 10 years worth of research. A year before the event, Clinton's trip to China had significantly improved the country's relations, as he was the first president to visit the country since the Tiananmen controversy. In turn, books about the Levinsky affair were explicitly banned. The Chinese had since the 80s idolized America, but the gutting of the embassy taught them a lesson in a rules-based global order that was put on trial in the Balkans. China quickly turned more realistic and strategic.
What will worry NATO is that the Chinese media is saying NATO deliberately spilled Chinese blood. Anti-American feeling is running so high, Americans have been warned to stay off the streets.
Since 1949, it had only held national mourning for state leaders, now choosing to honor the civilian victims. Another immediate change was how the Chinese media refused to display President Clinton's apologies, a way to prolong the infuriated anti-American protests. This tactic of giving fuel to victimization would be used again later in territorial disputes with Japan. Related to this is China's land reclamation program that constructs new islands and has redrawn geopolitics of that region without firing a bullet, defying international norms. The Hague has ruled the territorial claims as illegitimate. However, China has dismissed the decree and continued building. They realized that there's no reason for a state to restrain itself outside tactical advantage, thus following the model of expanding for self-preservation. Later in June 1999, the American-Russian escalation peaked during a spectacular end-of-the-script race to capture Pristina airport in Kosovo. Russian forces were stationed as UN peacekeepers in Bosnia, now unilaterally redeploying to protect Serbian population of northern Kosovo and possibly carve out a separate enclave. Ahead of NATO, the Russian troops succeeded in getting there first, which prompted a tense standoff. A famous exchange between the American NATO commander Wesley Clark and British General Mike Jackson occurred. The latter refused the orders to cut off the Russians, stating that he would not start World War III for the American. Instead, he established a working relationship with the Russian general in charge of the troops in Pristina. The British government backed this ruling, while the American NATO commander was denied support from home. The US instead pressured neighboring states, Bulgaria, Hungary and Romania, to blockade Russian reinforcements from using the airspace. This obscure incident showed how some abrupt open conflict between NATO and Russia is unlikely with Europe as collateral, even as Russia was close to crumbling under Yeltsin. It was without a doubt the move pushed by the Russians Siloviki, the informal military and security power base that had grown out of patience. Since then, the country has of course overhauled its military doctrines, which will be delved into later. The war in Kosovo was waged over two completely different domains. NATO practiced distance warfare for political reasons, and Milosevic conducted local warfare on an ethnic basis. This is the first real instance of asymmetric warfare, with two sides of an international conflict that used completely different units for different types of objectives. They were united in the interest of not wanting a land battle. Serbs safeguarded limited military assets, and NATO would need months to prepare. Besides being wary of the region's custom of militia war, Milosevic caved in under pressure from the rest of the Serbian oligarchy, which had an economic stake in the air-targeted infrastructure. The destruction of bridges also interrupted the Balkan route's black market activity that upheld a large income source. With the decade of wars coming to an end, the UN NATO regime in Kosovo had no further resources to fight a war against the newly established Albanian underworld, made up of the former Kosovo Liberation Army. Kosovo ended up as the center of fresh distribution networks that would spread the illicit goods and heroin from Turkey into the European Union. It still plays a big role today for the overall shadow economy that covers approximately 15 to 20% of the share revenue worldwide. After Arkan was assassinated, the Serbian defense minister was shot. With that, violent clashes happened weekly, as the fall of the Milosevic regime was inevitable. Oligarchs, mobsters, and the secret police were all laying odds around the regime change. Milosevic was swiftly ousted in a prototypical color revolution by the same foreign-influenced mobilization that the preceding wars had helped forestalling. In the end, he became the first nation leader to be tried for war crimes by the UN Tribunal. Opposing perceived corruption has been the consistent rhetorical motive among popular uprisings and insurgencies for the last 2 decades, with global effects. A functioning state holding relatively normal living conditions can, in a matter of months, have its citizens alongside foreign backing turn it into a scene for civil war or adjacent, as seen in Ukraine, by simply amplifying political frictions. Even though it's detrimental short-term, cases where the state is already weak and eroded, where development can be healthy as it erupts structural change. If the 2000s was the era of asymmetric conflicts, the 2010s were characterized by the blending of state and non-state strategies. We saw this process play out and evolve foremost in Ukraine and Syria, when IS, for example, held the second largest city in Iraq. They demonstrated how they had outpaced the Dominion by engaging in their own state building. While savage, it governed the population through institutions and perceived social legitimacy, rather than uncontrolled force and personal patronage. This made the counterinsurgency approach that had been used against the predecessors obsolete. The inverse case can be made with Russia, who by 2012 adopted a non-state military mode, emphasizing what has been called hybrid warfare, but officially known as the Gerasimov doctrine, mainly by unfolding adaptive, semi-autonomous assets, militias, separatists, and hackers, which targets infrastructure, business systems, and individuals. The doctrine takes heavy inspiration from the Chechen Wars, as well as the Israel-Lebanon War in 2006. General Gerasimov remarked how the rules of war, rather than the nature of war, was changing, and that traditional military means may only be asserted in a later or final phase to achieve key goals. The pro-EU uprising in Ukraine was seen as a resurrection of the snow revolution protest that Putin had been fighting at home. Ukraine straying from Russian orbit meant that he would lose traditionalist voters to nationalists. Meanwhile, his liberal opposition might be enticed to put on a similar Moscow Maidan unless something was done quickly to regain ground.
Ukraine in Europe's bloodiest war since the Balkans.
facilitating hybrid assets to stir up public dissatisfaction and ignite tensions. Part of this design involves directing and hijacking local insurgents. The stealth invasion of Crimea is a relevant example. Spetsnaz troops were popping up on the streets, pretending to be a self-defense militia, however lacking any insignia. The locals would notably give them the name the Little Green Men. Before the outside world could figure out what was really going on there, Crimea had been unified with Russia by a referendum. As Ukrainian troops were leaving Crimea, Russian ones gathered up around the eastern border regions. At this point, armed insurgencies also flared up in the provinces of Kharkov, Donetsk and Luhansk within the country's industrial heartland. All but Kharkov succeeded in separating. Whenever this subject is brought up, the central question always relates to who were fighting. Was Ukraine fighting separatists or Russians? Both answers are correct. Down the line in Donbass, a civilian airliner carrying 300 passengers was accidentally shot down, with both sides blaming each other. The official verdict stayed unresolved at the time, because UN investigators were simply blocked off the crash site. The event kicked off the Ukraine crisis into becoming a global issue, as well as shifting the balance of the conflict. The complex weapon system involved made it clear that it was not purely a people's militia that had emerged to fight in a domestic conflict. The consensus now is that Russian-backed separatists shot it down under the assumption that the plane was a military transport. This illustrates the principal alien problem in the interplay of formal and informal bodies. The latter made a bad choice that the backer would not have allowed if it had the field information available. A knowledge gap that gives the company leverage. For the most part, Russia used these volunteer troops while at times asserting standard forces when it was necessary to tip the balance. Following the South Ossetia example, when a region is able to be recognized by Russia as a state, it may create a military alliance and thus have undisguised military assets deployed. The active campaign to conceal what is Russian and what is the doing of separatists made the West unable to formulate an effective response. Centralization under Putin, backed by vast energy resources, enables Russia to placate and impede some of the Western sanctions. A complex web of interdependency is generated with companies who then lobby in favor of Russia to avoid financial losses. Considering the scope and amount of ties with worldwide integration, states do not act in their own interest with full resolve. Rather, it happens out of circumstance. Likewise, Russian policy is above all reactive and responds to occurrences outside its control. In contrast to the US, each development here is a new round. The war in Donbass is presently in a state of frozen conflict, formally stalemate without any peace agreement. This device works in Russia's favor as ongoing conflicts, unresolved borders and instability prevents countries from joining NATO. Eastern Ukraine is one of several hotspots dealing with breakaway states that could be stimulated in the future for further expansion into Kharkov, Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk, on the shores of Ossetia and Abkhazia and Georgia. The most distinguished but strategically useless frozen conflict concerns Transnistria in Moldova. When Moldova in 1990 declared independence from the Soviet Union, this small region sought to still be part of it, sparking an armed conflict. Russian troops supporting the separatist effort have stayed there since. There's an unexpected difference in cost here. Annexation, as sneaky as it was in practice, resulted in hard-hitting sanctions and isolation from the international community. Frozen conflicts, on the contrary, has allowed Russia to make gains, where the opposing country is on the defensive and takes losses. Veteran and related organizations furthering patriotism boosted the effort in mobilizing volunteers for Eastern Ukraine. This growing sentiment also contributed to neutralizing the political impact of the sanctions. The concept of military patriotic upbringing became an absolute priority for the Russian state entering 2016, establishing a youth army that has spread to Serbia, Slovenia, Armenia, and Abkhazia. They also materialized for the diaspora in Western countries, being funded through diplomatic departments. This undoubtedly creates a groundwork for future PMCs, from training to the successive employment. Long term, it could stand as an international legion, a structure that retains foreign nationals under a Russian protective umbrella. In Latvia, all associations with these youth camps have been made illegal, in contrast to recent EU-NATO members like Hungary, Poland and Czech Republic. Baltic states are a low-hanging fruit due to their ethnic Russian minorities, falling under the compatriot protection pretext and therefore the most tied-up countries by NATO. If any of the Baltics face real territorial challenges or separatism, the alliance would be discredited and its system of security guarantees offset. Just as Crimea allowed access to the Black Sea and link to the Mediterranean, the Baltics contain ice-free ports with a window to the west. Estonia is the holder of oil shale, making it of strategic importance, similar to the coal mines in eastern Ukraine. The city of Narva has been assumed by NATO to be the next following the Crimean model. It is Estonia's third largest city on the easternmost border, with 85% ethnic Russians. They have attempted to secede several times before during the early 90s, through referendums and local councils. The last vote gathered 98% support, while covering a voter turnout above 50%. The Estonian state court has ruled these results illegal. An early seed of hybrid warfare can be traced back to an event in Estonia in 2007, the so-called Bronze Night, referring to the massive rioting by ethnic Russians due to the removal of a Soviet bronze statue in Tallinn. Simultaneously, extensive hackings took place against the Estonian authorities, media and banks. The attacks have been ranked as second largest after Titan Reign. Narrative structuring here played up the Soviet interpretation of history, where the Baltic states were fascist and abused the Russian minorities. This functions to homogenize the national communities and sow out the divisions, inspiring loyalty to the modern state of Russia. The Orthodox Church is Russia's main front for soft or cultural power projection, similar to Middle Eastern countries using charities and community funding, while Western ones use think tanks and NGOs. There's been an increasing global crackdown on these clusters over the last 10 years, as they are recognized as drivers of foreign governments. The main beneficiaries here are the media groups that can play two sides, demanding transparency as well as covering for governments. Hybrid warfare is unique, not in that it's unconventional, but that the friction in available information can overstep the artificial insurgency, turning it into an unpredictable hot conflict. Out of nowhere, nuclear posturing can appear to force Western leaders into caution. Then within a week, there may suddenly be a ceasefire that freezes the conflict for a while, such as the Minsk Agreement. Applied hybrid warfare can go intentionally up and down in the intensity. It works as deterrence, escalating to de-escalate to the point where the adversary has lost its will, basically bluffing. Before Russian PMCs were normalized, future commanders from special forces trained, organized and equipped separatists in Donbass. They also conducted other pursuits there, diversions, intel gathering, sabotage and wet work, both to create leverage for their side but also to control the fighters on the ground. One of their notable performances was the assassination of a Cossack separatist commander with a car bomb, following his denunciation of the Luhansk president and attempts to further balkanize the republic. Threatening with secession is a common negotiating approach to emphasize local power. An early version of the Wagner group has been implicated in this purging, which has recurred. From this point on, various Russian PMCs operated on the front line. Some vanished while others later were transferred to Syria in 2016 in light of heavy defeats by pro-Assad forces. Ukraine can therefore be seen as a testing ground. Russian combat effectiveness had been conditional, with the Ukrainian army being demoralized and sluggish, excluding the volunteer battalions. The Wagner Group today stands as the most prominent Russian PMC, being a low-cost experimental tool that conducts a range of missions that the government claims no stake in, but whose owner is a close friend to Putin. The Russian constitution prevents mercenary activities, but it does not rule out working abroad, a known legal vacuum. Even though it can be changed, it's kept in order to guarantee control over them and the circulation of weapons, as well as limiting the PMC market to Putin's personal network. Wagner is no longer a private corporation, but the name for a geopolitical venture that Russia is engaged in. The basic model is supporting a ruling leader and in return get access to raw materials in order to ease Western sanctions. There have been around 3,000 Russian mercenaries present in Syria. Some of the companies have succeeded in taking back territory from insurgents and been rewarded with state contracts for oil and mining industries. The same kind of venture proceeding has been used in the new scramble of Africa, where Russia is late to the game, competing with French and US presence. The Central African Republic, for example, was under sanctions by UN Security Council. Despite this, Russia delivered arms and military trainers from Wagner outside the UN peacekeeper system. In Libya, the group is fighting on the behalf of General Haftar against the UN Turkey-supported Tripoli government. This trend enables Russia to shape the trajectory of ongoing and future conflicts. It's essentially a security export strategy. PMCs were also present on the Ukrainian side of the war. Oligarchs played an important role in stabilizing the country, being considered too wealthy to be bribed. The Ukrainian army is known to be corrupt, incompetent, and have Russian spies entangled. This created a space to empower quasi-legal paramilitaries, with very mixed motives of monetary gain and political power. Among them were Ukrainian nationalists as well as Chechens volunteering to preserve the state. As expected for a weak state, confrontations ensued, with the nationalist volunteers openly fighting the local police over the control of cigarette smuggling routes. To quickly regain public approval from these kinds of moves, they would practice arbitrary justice against drug dealers. At the time of this clash, they threatened to deploy fighters in Kiev if it wasn't resolved peacefully. This left the question of who was in charge. The lack of monopoly on legal violence was something that the Russian media capitalized on to undermine the Kiev rule. It was also assumed to be an elaborate ruse conducted by NATO to capture Ukraine. One Ukrainian oligarch who resides as a governor who used a PMC to quickly recapture the issue of the state's oil transport company, Transnafta, from alleged raiders. These types of occurrences are of course murky, with inner conflict among the economic strongmen expected. Just as with private forces, patriotism can become a liability for profit. PMC-style commodification is not entirely new for contemporary Russia. When the state was close to falling apart in the 90s, it denationalized a large chunk of its assets, acquired by insiders generally known as the oligarchs. Appearing after further economic transition was unconventional property repossession and corporate trading groups consisting of consultants from both the underworld and state agencies acting on their own. Of interest were clients who had been left out of previous insider schemes, as well as those wishing to consolidate their wealth. Armed gangs would storm headquarters of sworn companies, seize assets, extort shareholders, and coerce owners into signing property transfer documents. Since the financial default of 1999 has grown more advanced, the customer places an order for a raiding team. The team then acquires a minority share in the targeted firm and initiates trivial lawsuits against it, ensuing with a complex game of legal arbitrage exploiting imbalanced markets to greatly devalue its stock and cause bankruptcy. The raiders would soon after take it over completely. With this, they became an institution on the Russian marketplace, either as independent consultants or working under oligarchs, providing an alternative to formal mergers and acquisition. Some teams continued using criminal force as in the 90s, while others used bribes, organized strikes, and unplanned inspections by regulatory officials. Even though anti-raiding firms have popped up, There are no dependable defenses against the raiders, but have viable political connections. It's a mixture of political, business and criminal organizations, along with strategies. But each of the parties perfectly satisfied with this arrangement. Few raiding cases make it to court. In the early 2000s, around 80% of the leading Russian political figures had a background within KGB or its successor, FSB. After the transition into modern Russia, half of the KGB stayed and the other half became engaged in businesses, politics, NGOs and cultural associations. The broad network of security agencies started to adopt all political institutions at hand. And so is the use of entities such as Wagner for state or private purposes. Like with many other questions concerning Russia, it's both at once. Businesses operate under the premise that the state can mobilize them for any of its ends, with security services being forced upon company boards, a primitive sort of state capitalism, where corruption is the oil that keeps things going smoothly. Gazprom can turn off the tap if they need to squeeze a neighbor, and the armed companies will make deals with state allies. The true currency here is not the ruble, but political favors. This system of informal agreements, known as blat in Russian, originates from Soviet times, where criminals would create public access to commodities that were in short supply. Today's global market for private force has been estimated to circulate 100 billion a year. They are usually assumed to take the form of Blackwater, complementary to the US Army, protecting convoys and defending buildings. The late Russian rendition, however, has shown that they are not afraid to dive into both security and purely offensive operations. The line between established security companies and military ones are fading, from innocent activities such as supplies and logistics to increasingly offensive operations since 2015, covering politically contentious areas in the Middle East to obscure shambles in Africa. PMCs formally provide 1. Assistance, 2. Protection, 3. Training. Their effectiveness varies. In the case of Nigeria, they were employed in 2015 to oust Boko Haram, the other IS. Nigeria had not succeeded in removing Boko Haram for 6 years, which only took a few weeks for the South African STEP group to complete once integrated into the army. Similar to their acclaimed predecessor Executive Outcomes, they played a decisive role in using attack helicopters in company with night vision equipment, spearheading under evening hours to retake villages. The main advantage is that PMCs are cheaper than maintaining a standing army. Small yet affluent countries like the Gulf states may use them to participate in conflicts, seize assets, and secure targets. The United Arab Emirates, for example, has hired 2,000 South American contractors to support the Yemen government against the Houthi rebels in the civil war. The most common contracts are concentrated around protecting commercial vessels from Somali pirates. However, the biggest deals come from multinational corporations that concern themselves with the extraction of raw materials. PMCs are a viable alternative to the host regime's frequently bribed and inept local personnel. This became evident in 2013 when a BP gas plant in Nigeria was assaulted by Islamists, ending with 37 dead hostages of European origin. Shareholders in these kind of companies are going to demand that they deploy adequate yet disposable protection. For a country like the US that wishes to make ventures abroad, they are able to pursue their interest while concealing official losses, thus maintaining the confidence of the citizen shareholders. While Russian losses do have some impact on society, America exceeds in this case due to the sway of privatized media. Contractors made up 30% of the total US casualties in Iraq, Afghanistan and Kuwait from 2001 to 2011. Similar to Kadyrov's role in Chechnya as a pro-Putin strongman, PMC's innate exemption allows them to exercise savagery in regions that are difficult to control. Beyond military specialization, the ideal company is one that has local proficiency in the conflict zone, awareness of geography, customs, and key players. This makes them into an upgraded proxy, compared to local proxies with their own political plans and ethnic religious antagonisms in the way. This enterprise indeed lowers the entry barrier to war in general. The act of hiring replaceable units promotes risk-taking within the field, and the chess pieces are incentivized to drag out the duration of the conflict to maximize profit. Nor is there any court where clients and hired companies can settle their disputes, causing possible blood feuds. Even though the UN banned mercenaries in 1989, they were forced to outsource their peacekeeping efforts in Sierra Leone during the mid-90s. This happened side by side to preceding UN controversies in Somalia and Rwanda. A company of former South African Special Forces under the name Executive Outcomes took the contract and showed themselves incredibly effective. They turned mercenaries from an individual trade to an industry. The legality remains ambiguous as only individual mercenaries, not PMCs themselves, are prohibited by the UN, and that then sets a precedent for secondary nations. The overall cost for EO's mission in Sierra Leone was far less than UN's previous abortions. EO received $25 million, while during the UN effort, commanded a price of $1.2 billion. Other anecdotes include them deploying just 1 month after signing the contract, disposing of stagnant bureaucracy, whereas the UN peacekeepers would idle from 3 to 12 months. Eric Prince, the founder of the defunct Blackwater, is now providing security for China's Belt and Road Initiative in Africa and Asia under the Frontier Services Group. One former chief executive proclaimed that this company has turned into an arm for the Chinese state run by Americans. Before that, Prince tried to get political entry into the European Union during the height of the migrant crisis by proposing a joint border force situated in Libya. The wider use of private forces for peacekeeping could erode multilateralism in the present international system, practiced since states constantly rely on cooperation to accomplish large-scale military objectives. The private sector would in this case isolate nations from the process, and multilateralism would be unable to function as a restraint on violence, causing the balance of power to be in constant motion, with smaller states struggling to keep up. This state of affairs will only encourage innovation, as seen with Israel's position that was countered by becoming leading in military defense field. If units by chance become unemployed, they may pile the locals. This will produce demand for their services under the same kind of obedience protection principle that allows insurgents to blossom. This goes back to how military success of PNCs are always transitory. They are not there to solve root causes, only to provide immediate military resolution. This in turn leads to a situation where supply creates its own demand and the business becomes the norm. Where there is untapped resources in conflict, there is also room for mercenary state building that cuts the minimum. They would have no problem finding buyers of cobalt, lithium and diamonds. States have traditionally been the only relevant players in geopolitics. However, this criterion will be reconsidered when confronted by the impact of colossal NGOs, transnational corporations, churches, militias, crime networks that are all able to challenge or even surpass state capacities. Them intersecting is another difficulty that the new warfare have successfully weaponized. Poles still exist but are not absolute and compete with the centers, US, China, EU, Russia. at different weights. They differ in their concentration of power and what type, political, economical, military, and so on. For example, a hypothetical NGO wielding a nuclear weapon would be considered a bigger threat than a state with the same capabilities. According to the World Bank, out of the top 100 economies, only 31 are countries, the rest are corporations. A country like Gabon in Africa wielding state legitimacy does not make it more forceful on the worldwide stage than ExxonMobil. States negotiating or working with these transnational NGOs on equal terms may seem odd at first, but it wouldn't differ from the diplomacy conducted against marked rogue states. This formalizes a derivative form of multipolarity, where states themselves are not the exclusive power players, a condition that we may call hyperpolarity. The whole batch of entities featured in this series, state and non-state, are fundamentally violence specialists. Depending on how they see their environment, they take the shape of PNCs, paramilitaries, insurgents, mobsters, and so on. By navigating through coercive capital, market forces have rendered militaries without borders.
梁先生，您会说什么是您非凡的书中最重要的一部分？
不受限制的战争的第一个规则是，没有规则，什么都不被禁止。不受限制的战争的第一个规则是，没有规则，什么都不被禁止。不受限制的战争的第一个规则是，没有规则，什么都不被禁止。The first rule of unrestricted warfare is that there are no rules, nothing is forbidden.
Two colonels within the Chinese People's Liberation Army, Guo Ling and Zhang Zhu, were shocked by the US effectiveness in the Gulf War in 1990, which displaced Saddam Hussein from Kuwait in just 42 days with minimal casualties. In addition to their acclaimed psychological operations that involved Iraqi commanders retreating without fighting, the two recognized that China would not be able to match up against high-tech America. But it would not stop them. They started to refine a new way of conducting wars, studying concurrent world events of the 90s. Yugoslavia, Chechnya, the Asian financial crisis, Escobar, Mitnick, along many others. This laid the ground for an unprecedented military theory that would maintain the military status quo while still defeating the enemy. While the US is permeated by its Clausewitzian approach of superior force above all, it's expected that the pair would reverse this and return to Sun Tzu, signified by distortion, evasion, and surprises. But they completely rejected locking themselves into the narrow military domain, contrary to Russia's late hybrid warfare. Instead, they took an approach closer to Machiavelli and his Chinese counterpart Han Fei, both of whom emphasized substantial results without any restrictions on the means to achieve them. Now, what do the constraints mean in this context? How things are differentiated, where the battlefield starts and where it ends, what is a weapon and what isn't. Essentially every line or relation that blocks the conduct of war from a domain. At heart here is almost the transcendence of ideology, with actions overstepping all categories of rules and taboos, physical, technical, etc., when necessary and possible. What it does not mean is that the most extreme means need to be picked everywhere and at every point, like some predictable dogma not matched with reality. China and the US obviously don't want an open conflict, as it would wreck both parties' economies. The common security dilemma, however, causes peaceful countries to behave in ways that can be interpreted as violations by the other, depending on circumstances and their interests. With the deterrence and taboo containing the use of nukes since World War II, there's been an ever-increasing trend towards decentralization. The Chinese interpret this process as when something reaches an extreme, it takes the opposite direction. For the colonels, this meant that instead of looking at new armaments, it is necessary to take a step back and explore military structuring, especially since contemporary technology has distorted the military-civilian distinction. There are countless cases of Chinese, Russian and Turkish hackings, for example. Another one is fishermen becoming militiamen during territorial disputes. Should these be considered military or civilian entities? This is just a tiny sample of semi-autonomous fields in prevailing state competition. just like how proxy wars replaced direct intervention due to heavy cost, be it political, financial or material. The Chinese-American interdependence further compresses this to take the form of instrumental micro-proxies in order to alter the balance between the countries. The logical end to the author's vision of additional types of non-military warfare implies nations being overwhelmed without spilling blood. They would also question what fundamentally is a weapon. Is Hawaii or 5G one in an ongoing tech Cold War? Is an influential media channel such as CNN a weapon? At the time when the channel published pictures of dead troops for sensationalism, it became a weapon of subversion turned inward, as it resulted in a foreign policy setback. This is one example of how the American approach to war has come with side effects that made it liable as a hegemon. High reluctance against casualties and demanding international assistance, paralleled with over-reliance on advanced technology. Each generation of arms costs more to develop and manufacture. Overcommitting to conventional areas of strength inevitably opens up to unconventional side strokes. In February 1999, the pair finalized the work labeled Unrestricted Warfare. It would not substitute a Chinese revolution in military affairs as demanded by the technologists. Rather, it would transcend it, declaring that a victory in the 21st century would require them not purely to rely on military, but also unarmed warfare, as well as combinations, warfare beyond limits. It's necessary to dare to completely redefine the circumstances in a way that doesn't see the adversary as more significant than one's nation strength, therefore inquiring and going outside the established thinking of how gains can be brought. With the release, Prevailing famously told a reporter that the first rule of unrestricted warfare is that there are no rules, nothing is forbidden. 1 month later, the book became solidified in the public mind, along with the attack on the Chinese embassy. As presented by Prevailing and Wang Sangsu, methods of warfare for competing states. Ecological warfare in theory would include tech used to influence the natural state of oceans, polar ice sheets, and spur earthquakes. Other approaches, creating monopolies by setting the standards independently, taking the earliest opportunities to set up regulations in international law, smuggling to set markets into confusion. The types of creative non-military or blended methods hinted at here are endless, and they would be just as relevant for conventional wartime, which solidifies the viewpoint. Parts of this conceptual framework was officially adopted by the PLA under the Free Warfares program, focusing on 3 paths that mutually reinforce each other: coordinated psyops, covert media manipulation, and lawfare that concerns strategy and defense policies. All of them converge in influencing the perception of populations, militaries, and elites abroad relevant to China's interests. The primary example has been Taiwan, where they make use of political and social frictions, undermining trust and steering views closer to future reunification. Some of the more abnormal practices from the book that did not make it into official state policy still corresponds with real politics. The contentiousness here is of course to their advantage. For instance, China has been revealed as the source of synthetic drug production and smuggling, primarily related to opioids often disguised as legal pharma. These illicit drugs have soared overdoses in the US exponentially from 2013 and onward, transpiring into a declared public health crisis that breaks up families and damages the economy. Trump has repeatedly accused Xi Jinping of failing to meet the agreements hindering this export to the US. While there are no direct links to the Chinese government, turning a blind eye through poor regulation, corruption, and lack of action on drug control still has the same effects as if it was calculated. Another possibility is that these off-the-record practices simply fall under intelligence operations. The indicated pattern in Chinese politics may also be seen during the Hong Kong riots in 2019, when triad gangs were deployed to attack protesters, with law enforcement at the same time vanishing and staying unresponsive. Looking at this type of arrangement from the international arena makes a clearer picture emerge. A related case to the opioid crisis is China's monopoly on rare earth metals, which function as their ace card in the trade war. This material is a crucial component for defense systems, consumer tech, data centers, and solar panels. Formerly the Deng Xiaoping likened it to the oil of the Middle East. China holds 90% of the global rare earth production. At the same time, the US relies on them for 80% of its rare earth imports. With the course towards 5G, AI vehicles, and quantum computing, it becomes a very powerful commercial and diplomatic bargaining chip. Previous hints of pulling the trigger have caused big stock market scares. However, the actual probability is very low, as it would escalate things fast. It was previously used against Japan in 2010, after they had arrested a Chinese fishing captain amid an ongoing territorial dispute. Chinese customs officials blocked rare earth elements from being loaded on board ships heading to Japan, while the government reacted allegations of any imposed ban. This informal act made it hard for Japan to file a case to the World Trade Organization, asserting a breach against free trade rules of disrupting commercial contracts. It worked out in the end nonetheless, and China was forced to recommence its exports to Japan. Using the pandemic as a pretext, China has now withheld big quantities of this strategic resource for internal use, something that the World Trade Organization will not classify as a breach of international trade laws. This worked as a wake-up call for both the US as well as Europe, who are now pursuing new extractive investments. The mutual economic dependence between the US and China does not exist in the case of Russia. This is the simple explanation for the divergence in escalation. China is a rising power with territorial and economic ambitions, which has an inevitable conflict with US interests, thus not trying to succeed its hegemony but rejecting it. Russia is a declining power that knows it will never compete with the US on a larger scale, making it a zero-sum game. Confrontation by any of the two means following the steps of the Soviet Union, competing on a straightforward military level, i.e. nuclear games. This is why it's rather about exploiting vulnerabilities to gain unilateral advantages. Russia is pursuing a vertical maneuver by controlling and shaping the intensity and detectability. This comes from remaining under the threshold of not prompting an international military response, not openly declaring any war. For instance, it was formerly separatists acting out in eastern Ukraine, not Russian forces. Indirect tampering would in this case not straight away heighten the conflict, but rather intensify it. China's mode is the horizontal maneuver, generating an array of challenges that the adversary cannot respond to or is oblivious to the overall picture. Considering the economic integration, sanctions and military threats will only escalate things or backfire. Thus, currency revaluation and devaluation becomes viable. Manipulating environmental conditions and using criminals, for example, is entirely out of the norm for any state notion of war. This kind of neglect in international security creates a gap that may be exploited by states to pass detection. The strongest US capabilities are clustered in the center of this spectrum, from economic through military, space and cyber. Any attempts to escalate in this part of the spectrum would involve symmetrical confrontation and possible conflict. The complete opposite to this escalation model could be seen with the IS, who would go to lengths to draw Western state actors into the open and urge polarization rather than engage in proxy wars. The Russian-Chinese model does not equal asymmetric warfare, since they still keep the conventional military options open, together with the enhancement of transmilitary in Russia's case or non-military means in China's case, not to mention the combinations in the latter. These philosophies are really just hiding in plain sight, and there's nothing that limits them to solely Russia-China. Politics is the continuation of war by other means. The range of contemporary tools available for states to achieve political outcomes are vast, and the pace is fast. Fundamentally, it's about the damage in whatever nature that can be inflicted to an adversary, without violating the line of war and peace. If this grey zone expands, it will inevitably lower the threshold for escalation, from the arena of competition to some kind of confrontation. The borders of power spheres, the Sino-Indian frontier, the Bay of Bengal, and surrogates in Africa are all possible Cold War reminiscent hotspots. The access to African cobalt, oil, gold, copper, and iron ore will likely be disrupted by civil wars or choked by late competition. China has so far negated these recurrences through stabilization projects. Being the generator of global growth since the 2008 financial crisis, it's slowing down as the regional powers are emerging to take over that role. Meanwhile, some states are balancing their military and economic alliances between the US and China in order to maximize freeloading. States might act in ways that can be described as warlike. However, with an archaic and poor definition of warfare, one party may remain oblivious to it, while having its societal fabric worn down through ambiguous warfares. The stability of this framework depends on the victim having to preserve its political capacity towards more outright threats, a point where it's in its general favor to retaliate. The implicit use of these measures have increased under Xi Jinping's rule, with economic financial warfare along with IP thefts being at the top most discernible instances that other countries can take lessons from and engage at the political level. Unrestricted Warfare was published over 20 years ago. Today we have arrived at its logical conclusion. We live in both peace and war because everywhere is a battlefield.
The target was something close to the Chinese embassy, some offices where you running. Are you that important for the NATO and US, you think?
I will tell you one thing. They wanted to show that the only friend we have, Chinese people, they wanted to show that they don't care, that they can attack there too.
Do you feel abandoned by the Western world?
Well, I will tell you, it's a new world order.
そいつが言うにゃどうか交換だと誘惑従いざれごとに溺れ出した王様ゲーム強制参加拒否権なんて聞いちゃくれない課せられたクエストにはあのノブを殺せ絶望だ絶望まみれ少年に逃げ込んだ現実はなったった欲望ないとか偽り偽善者ぶても仕方ねえや憧れた夢なんだっけヒーローになりたいのうっぷっぷ願い口にする愛にくばかり続ける薬はない